Hey, and welcome to my channel where I experiment with different materials and techniques. In this video, we will be cleaning a fox skull at home. I'm very excited to make this video because when I first started this channel, this was one of the first videos I wanted to make. Recently, I've also dabbled a bit in small game taxidermy, so this will make a nice entry for a taxidermy video series as well. This should be self-explanatory, but we are processing an animal head in this video, and if that is something you don't want to see, please exit this video now. I've cleaned quite many skulls with different methods and also seen other people use certain methods, so let's go through the most common ways to clean a skull and the pros and cons of them. Let's start with beetles. Museums and some taxidermists use Dermestid beetles to clean skulls. These beetles, or especially their larvae, eat decaying flesh on a fairly fast rate, and they do a really good job at getting rid of all the tissue around and inside the skull. I have only seen these beetles in action when I was working at a natural history museum where they had a separate climate-controlled room for the beetles, and I don't remember the room having an odor, but I'm not sure if it is easy or odorless to keep these beetles at home. I also assume that most people don't want to keep insects, especially because if these beetles escape, they can potentially destroy any biological specimens you might have. And it can take months for the colony to get big enough to clean skulls fast enough, so if you are not planning on cleaning skulls on a regular basis, then this might not be the best option for you. The second option on the list is burying. The easiest method to clean a skull is to bury it and let nature take care of the cleaning. This can, however, take quite long and can be difficult if you live in a cold climate and are trying to do this in the wintertime. One popular way of cleaning skulls is maceration. Maceration is a process where the skull is put into a closed container with warm water and the flesh is being decomposed naturally by bacteria. Over time, the flesh starts to fall off of the bone, which is then easy to scrape off. This method works especially well for specimens that don't have much flesh on them, but it can be smelly and you would most likely need a yard or a garage for this method. The technique I have been using the most is boiling my skulls, and that's what I will be doing with this red fox skull here. The benefits are that it doesn't require anything else than a dedicated pot for boiling skulls. It's also quite fast, and in theory, it shouldn't be any more gross than boiling any meat if you are working with a fresh specimen. The drawback of this method is that it can draw fat from the flesh and make it seep into the skull. What grease does to the bone is that it can turn parts of it yellow or translucent and make it smelly and greasy to touch. Over time, it can also weaken the skull. One thing worth mentioning before we go forward with the video is that cleaning skulls takes time, and it's not even the part where you remove the flesh from the bone, but the degreasing part, which we will get into later in this video. But let's start cleaning the skull. The skull I had was frozen, so I didn't do any initial fleshing on it, but just put it in a pot with water. I'm heating the water to the point where it's almost simmering. The flesh should come off of a small game skull in about an hour or less, and a bigger skull like a deer might require more time and maybe even a bigger pot. Some people say that when the flesh on top of the head splits, the skull has been boiled enough. However, be careful not to boil the skull too long as it can weaken it. I removed the skull a bit earlier, discarded the water, and let the skull sit until it was cool enough to work with. Once the skull is cooled down, you can start picking off the flesh. You can get the brain out by using a crochet hook, wire, or a similar kind of instrument. Here I'm using a sculpting tool that can be bought from a taxidermy store or a crafting store. I like to wear nitrile gloves when I work with wild specimens and especially skulls, because although the skull is boiled, I want to minimize any risk of catching a potential disease. For the same reason, I use a dedicated pot for my skulls, and I never use that pot to cook food. I'm mainly trying to avoid things like rabies and prions. Rabies is a deadly virus that is carried by many wild animals, such as foxes, and if you get rabies and start showing symptoms, there's usually no hope for you at that point. Rabies spreads through saliva that enters through a cut or a mucous membrane, and there's always some saliva on these skinned heads, so I'm wearing gloves to prevent getting any scratches. Prions are equally as scary, if not even scarier than rabies. Prions are basically misfolded proteins that can affect the healthy version of the same protein, and they are suspected to be the cause behind many neurodegenerative diseases like mad cow's disease and Kuru. And since they affect the proteins in the brain, there's also a higher chance of them residing in the brain matter. Prions are also quite resistant to heat, so they might not get denatured in this fairly mild boiling process. I think I could have boiled my skull a bit longer or in a warmer temperature, as the flesh was still quite attached to the skull. However, since the heat will dissolve the fat in the flesh, there's a higher risk of the skull absorbing that the more you boil it. This skull had some tissue still attached to it after this initial cleaning. I know some people add different substances like baking soda to the water when they boil their skulls to help loosen the tissue, but since I don't know what those things do to the skull in the long term, I cannot recommend them. At this point, I chose to both start the degreasing process as well as try to macerate the rest of the tissue. So I washed the pot I boiled the skull in and placed the skull back there with warm water and Dawn dish soap. Then I placed the pot back on the stove and kept it there on a low heat for around 4 to 6 hours a day for a week. The basic idea behind degreasing is that the dish soap dissolves the fat from the bone and the heat speeds up the process. You don't necessarily need a heat source, but then you will need to keep your skull in the degreasing solution for a longer time. Generally, the degreasing process can last anywhere from a week to months, depending on how big or greasy your skulls are. Small animals like squirrels barely need degreasing, whereas greasy animals like bears might need to be placed in a specific degreasing tank for months. Some people might use stronger chemicals to degrease skulls, like ammonia or acetone, but the reason why I don't use them is that they are dangerous to work with and difficult to discard in a safe manner. It's also extremely important to be sure that there is no acetone in the bone before the skull goes through the whitening process, because acetone and peroxide should not be mixed. I didn't measure the amount of Dawn, I just added it until the water was blue. If you need an exact amount, some sources say that you can use around 1/4 cup of Dawn to 5 gallons of water. After heating the water for some time, it turned from blue to clear, and after some days, you could see some of the fat droplets floating on the surface. I removed the skull after a week and washed all the remaining tissue off that had now been softened by the process. I separated the mandible bones to remove the bone marrow and pulled out any loose teeth to get any stuck tissue removed. There was also still some tissue left in the nasal cavity that I was able to flush out. Once I had cleaned the skull entirely from the tissue, I decided to whiten it. This is an optional step, so if you like your skulls to look more natural, you can skip this step entirely. The reason I'm doing this is that while peroxide doesn't really work well as a degreaser, it will make it easier for me to see if there's a lot of grease left on the skull, because when you whiten the skull, you will not get it white if there is too much grease left, and that grease will leave either yellow, orange, or translucent spots on the skull. I'm using 30 volume hydrogen peroxide, which is basically a cream developer I use for bleaching my hair. I'm spreading it on the skull and the jaws and put them in a Ziploc bag for 6 hours. You can keep them there for up to 12 hours too, but I just didn't want to leave anything processing overnight. Most people opt to use the 40 volume peroxide, and usually in its clear liquid form, but this is something I just happen to have at hand. Don't use anything else than hydrogen peroxide, and do not mix this with the bleaching powder that you would use when you're bleaching hair. Bleach degrades the bone tissue and might keep degrading it long after you have bleached your skull, and eventually the skull might just start crumbling apart. Also, if you're working with peroxide, especially 40 volume peroxide, be extremely careful with metal instruments, as peroxide reacts very violently with iron and can be very dangerous, so use plastic instead. For that reason, I personally don't recommend heating peroxide either. After the quick whitening, I left the skull to dry, but even after days it looked like there were parts that were not dry. I wasn't sure if it was moisture trapped inside where the marrow is, or if it was grease, and since it had been rainy all week, I couldn't take the skulls outside to dry in the sun. So just to be safe, I put the skulls back in a mixture of Dawn and water and degreased it for another 2 weeks, sometimes heating the mixture up. After that, I mixed some of that 30 volume peroxide with water and submerged the skull in that mixture for a day. And once the peroxide was mixed with water, it was probably around 10 volume. I did this to get the skull a bit more white and to get the peroxide a bit deeper into the bone tissue and potentially act as a bit of a disinfectant as well. After that, I washed it carefully and placed the skull outside in the sun. The UV light actually amplifies the peroxide's whitening effect, although I'm not sure how much it reacts with the peroxide now that it has been rinsed off. However, the sunlight itself is known to whiten bones naturally, so this will further help to dry and whiten the skull. Once the skull was dry, it was time to glue the mandibles and the teeth in their places. When it comes to glue, I would suggest super glue. At first, I only had Mod Podge and a hot glue gun, but neither of those would keep the mandibles together, so I went and bought some Gorilla Glue, and you really just need a drop of this to keep things together. The teeth I was able to stick back with just Mod Podge, but Gorilla Glue would probably work very well for that as well. It's up to you to decide if you want to glue the lower jaw to the skull or how you want to display the skull in the first place. You could also use some kind of protective coating on your skull or decorate it with something. I like to keep mine untreated because it will be easier to degrease the skull again in the future if any fat starts to resurface. There's still some translucency on the skull, which might be some grease, but I think that it falls under an acceptable amount. I hope this video was helpful for choosing the right skull cleaning method for you, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see the rest of the taxidermy series. Next time we will be tanning a fox hide for taxidermy, so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching and happy crafting!